The United States is willing to pay $700 billion for an island covered in ice. Let that number sink in for a second. 700 billion. That's not a rumor. That's not a meme. According to former officials and policy insiders, that's the actual price range being discussed behind closed doors right now. $700 billion. For Greenland. An island that produces almost nothing. An island with no real industry. An island where 80% of the land is buried under ice up to 2 miles thick. To put that number in perspective, adjusted for inflation, the United States paid less than that for every territorial acquisition in its entire history combined. The Louisiana Purchase. Alaska. Half the continental United States. All of it, cheaper than what's now being floated for Greenland. So the obvious question is, why? What exactly is sitting on this frozen island that suddenly makes it worth more than the biggest land deals in American history? If you turn on the news or read policy reports, you'll hear the same two answers repeated over and over again. National security. Rare earth minerals. That's the official story. But here's the problem. Those explanations don't actually explain anything. Because the United States already has a military base in Greenland. We've had one since World War II. Missile detection systems. Early warning radar. A permanent strategic foothold in the Arctic. From a pure defense standpoint, America already has what it needs. And as for rare earths, those minerals didn't magically appear last year. Geologists mapped Greenland's deposits decades ago. They've been known since the Cold War. So why now? Why did Greenland suddenly jump from interesting but impractical to top-tier foreign policy priority? Why are senior officials calling it urgent? Why are cost estimates being drawn up? Why are people inside Washington talking about this as if time is running out? Because something changed. Not politically, not diplomatically, physically. Something is happening to Greenland itself, right now, that is transforming it from a frozen strategic outpost into one of the most valuable pieces of geography on the planet. And once you see what that change is, the $700 billion price tag starts to feel less insane. Welcome to Finance Archives. Today we're breaking down what's really happening in Greenland, why the Arctic suddenly matters more than it has in centuries, and why the fight over this island has almost nothing to do with what's buried underground, and everything to do with what's disappearing from the surface. In the next part, we'll start with what Greenland actually looks like today, because the reality of this place makes the obsession even more puzzling. And that's where this story really begins. Let's ground this story in reality for a moment, because when you strip away the headlines and the rhetoric, Greenland does not look like a place worth fighting over. Greenland covers about 836,000 square miles. That's roughly 3 times the size of Texas. Sounds massive. But here's the catch. More than 80% of that land sits under a permanent ice sheet. In some areas that ice is 2 miles thick. Not seasonal snow. Not melting glaciers. Solid ice that hasn't moved for thousands of years. The entire population of Greenland is about 56,000 people. That's smaller than most American suburbs. And those people aren't spread evenly across the island. They live in small coastal towns, isolated settlements separated by mountains, ice, and ocean. There are no roads connecting cities. If you want to travel between towns, you go by boat. Or by helicopter. That's it. No highways. No railroads. No national grid tying the country together. The economy reflects that reality. Greenland's entire GDP is around $3.5 billion. For context, that's less than the annual revenue of a mid-sized American shopping mall chain. Fishing dominates the economy. A little tourism. Some public services. And every single year, Denmark sends Greenland a subsidy of roughly $500 million just to keep the system running. Without that money, the government doesn't function. This is not a resource powerhouse. This is not an industrial hub. This is not an emerging market. It's a sparsely populated Arctic territory that survives on fishing and financial support. So when people say, Greenland is valuable, you have to ask, valuable compared to what? Because nothing about its current economy justifies a 9-figure investment, let alone $700 billion. And yet, the United States is treating Greenland as if it's indispensable. Senior officials are being assigned to work on acquisition proposals. The conversation has shifted from curiosity to planning. This isn't a thought experiment anymore, which makes the mismatch impossible to ignore. If Greenland is so economically insignificant, if it already hosts an American military base, if its minerals have been known for decades but never profitably extracted, why is this suddenly urgent? Why does it feel like Washington believes this is a now or never moment? Because the value of Greenland is not in what it produces today. It's in what it's about to become. And that transformation has nothing to do with politics, ideology, or diplomacy. It has to do with physics. In the next part, we're going to talk about the one variable that changes everything. The ice. Not someday. Not in a distant climate model. Right now. For most of modern history, Greenland's ice was its greatest limitation. It made construction expensive, mining impractical, transportation nearly impossible. The ice protected Greenland from attention. But that protection is disappearing. Greenland's ice sheet is melting at a rate of hundreds of billions of tons per year. Not projections. Not estimates. Measured loss. Since the mid-1990s, an area roughly the size of a small European country has vanished from the ice sheet. Every single hour, tens of millions of tons of ice disappear into the ocean. And that pace is accelerating. This isn't a future scenario. This isn't by the end of the century. This is happening now. And when the ice retreats, it doesn't just raise sea levels. It rewrites geography. Land that was inaccessible for thousands of years is becoming reachable. Coastlines are changing shape. Harbors that couldn't exist before are starting to make sense. But more importantly, the Arctic itself is opening. For centuries, the Arctic was a wall. An impassable barrier of ice separating the world's major economies. That wall is cracking. And Greenland sits directly in the middle of the opening. As the ice thins and retreats, shipping routes that once existed only in theory are becoming real. Not experimental. Not seasonal curiosities. Viable corridors for global trade. And that's where Greenland's value begins to change, not gradually but exponentially. Because geography doesn't care about politics. You don't get to vote on where shipping lanes pass. You don't negotiate with ocean currents. If the ice melts, ships will take the shortest routes available. And those routes pass Greenland. This is why the timing matters. The minerals didn't suddenly appear. The military logic didn't suddenly change. The environment did. And once that shift begins, it doesn't reverse on human timescales. Every year that passes makes Greenland more accessible. Every year increases traffic, attention, and competition. This is why policymakers aren't talking about Greenland like a long-term curiosity anymore. They're talking about it like a closing window. Because whoever positions themselves now shapes the rules later. In the next part, we're going to look at what those new Arctic routes actually mean. And why controlling the gateways matters far more than owning the land itself. That's where Greenland stops being a frozen island. And starts looking like a global choke point. For most of global history, trade followed the same narrow paths. Through the Suez Canal. Around the Cape of Good Hope. Across choke points that every major power learned to protect. Or fight over. But melting ice is creating new shortcuts. Routes that don't just shave off a little time. They redraw the map of global commerce. 2 Arctic passages matter more than all the others combined. The Northwest Passage running along the top of North America. And the Transpolar Sea Route, cutting straight across the Arctic Ocean. Both reduce shipping distance between Asia and Europe by thousands of miles. That's not a marginal gain. That's weeks of time saved. Millions in fuel costs. Entire logistics chains rewritten. And here's the critical detail. Both routes pass right by Greenland. You don't need to own every mile of ocean to control a route. You just need to control the gateways. The ports. The refueling points. The search and rescue infrastructure. The surveillance. That's how maritime power has always worked. Whoever controls the entry points sets the rules. Fees, access, security, priorities. Today, Arctic shipping is still limited. Seasonal. Risky. But that's changing fast. Insurance models are adjusting. Ship designs are adapting. Ice-class fleets are expanding. What used to be experimental is becoming commercial. And once global shipping companies commit capital to new routes, they don't turn back. They build infrastructure. They sign long-term contracts. They lock in patterns that last decades. This is why Greenland isn't valuable today. It's valuable before the traffic fully arrives. Because once the Arctic becomes a standard corridor, once ports are built and routes normalized, the power structure is already set. Latecomers don't get to renegotiate geography. This is the same reason Britain dominated global trade for centuries. Why Singapore matters far more than its size suggests. Why narrow stretches of water have shaped empires. Greenland sits at the crossroads of routes that didn't exist before, but soon will. And that alone would make it strategically important. But shipping routes are only half the story. Because trade follows security. And the Arctic isn't just opening to commerce. It's reopening as a military theater. In the next part, we're going to talk about a stretch of ocean most people have never heard of. A place that quietly decides who controls access between the Arctic and the Atlantic. That's where Greenland stops being about trade and starts being about power. There's a reason militaries obsess over maps. Not political maps. Not borders. Geographic ones. Because some places quietly decide who moves freely, and one of those places is a stretch of water known as the GIUK Gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. 3 landmasses forming a narrow maritime corridor between the Arctic Ocean and the North Atlantic. Any submarine leaving the Arctic and heading toward the Atlantic has to pass through this gap. There is no alternative route. During the Cold War, this was one of the most heavily monitored regions on Earth. Sonar arrays, patrol aircraft, naval tracking. What? Because this is how you detect submarines before they disappear into the open ocean. Control the GIUK Gap, and you control access between 2 entire oceans. After the Cold War, attention faded. The Soviet Navy declined. The threat felt distant. Budgets were cut. And Greenland became quiet again. But the Arctic didn't stay quiet. Over the past decade, Russia has rebuilt its Arctic military presence, aggressively. Old Soviet bases reopened. Airfields reconstructed. Missile systems deployed. Russia now maintains more Arctic military infrastructure than any other country. They control more than half of the Arctic coastline. They operate nuclear-powered icebreakers at a scale no one else can match. They treat the Arctic as core strategic territory, not a side project. Meanwhile, American presence in Greenland shrank. At its peak during the Cold War, there were thousands of U.S. personnel on the island. Today that number is closer to a few hundred. Enough to maintain systems. Not enough to dominate the region. This imbalance matters. Because military power follows access. If Arctic shipping increases, if resource extraction expands, if infrastructure spreads along new routes, then whoever controls the surrounding security environment sets the tone. Rules, limits, deterrence, and Greenland sits directly beside the most important access point of all. This is why we already have a base, isn't the same as we control the space. A base is a foothold. Control is leverage. And leverage becomes more valuable when competitors are active. Russia isn't the only one watching. In the next part, we'll talk about the other power quietly positioning itself in the Arctic. A country with no Arctic territory at all, but a very clear long-term strategy. And once you factor that in, Greenland stops looking like a defensive concern and starts looking like a race. Russia is rebuilding power in the Arctic. But it's not the most dangerous variable in this equation. The real vulnerability comes from a country that doesn't even border the Arctic. China. In 2018, China officially declared itself a near-Arctic state. Not informally. Not rhetorically. On paper. China has no Arctic coastline. No Arctic population. No territorial claim. And yet, it announced an Arctic strategy anyway. What? Because China doesn't think in terms of borders. It thinks in terms of supply chains. Over the past 2 decades, China quietly built dominance over something most people never think about: rare earth elements. These aren't precious metals. They're not rare because they're hard to find. They're rare because they're hard to process. 17 elements that sit quietly on the periodic table and quietly power modern civilization. Electric vehicle motors, wind turbines, smartphones, guided missiles, radar systems, satellite components. Modern warfare and green energy both depend on them. And China controls roughly 70% of global rare earth processing. Not just mining. Processing. That's the bottleneck. The United States and Europe might have deposits. But without processing capacity, those deposits are meaningless. This creates a strategic nightmare. Imagine a serious geopolitical crisis. Taiwan. Sanctions. Trade restrictions. China doesn't need to fire a shot. It just stops exports. And suddenly, the ability to manufacture advanced weapons, electronics, and energy infrastructure collapses. This isn't hypothetical. This is a known risk that defense planners openly worry about. So when policymakers look at Greenland, they don't just see ice and geography. They see one of the few places on Earth with large rare earth deposits outside Chinese control. Deposits that include both light and heavy rare earths. The exact mix advanced manufacturing needs. On paper, Greenland looks like a solution. A Western alternative. A way to break dependency. A strategic insurance policy. But here's the catch. Greenland doesn't actually produce rare earths. Not one commercial mine. 0. Because mining there is brutally difficult. Extreme cold. Short seasons. No roads. No rail. And processing rare earths isn't just expensive, it's environmentally toxic. Radioactive waste. Chemical runoff. Local opposition has blocked projects for decades. Companies have tried. Most failed. So why does Greenland matter if extraction is still so hard? Because the same force opening shipping routes is slowly changing mining economics too. As ice retreats, as access improves, as infrastructure becomes viable, projects that were impossible become merely expensive. And expensive is something governments are willing to subsidize. When national security is at stake. This is why interest in Greenland isn't about today's production. It's about locking in tomorrow's options. Because if the Arctic opens fully, and China already has influence, infrastructure, or access, the window closes. In the final part, we're going to pull all of this together. The ice, the trade routes, the military geography, the minerals, and explain why the fight over Greenland is moving from theory to pressure, and why ownership may not be the real goal at all. So when you zoom out far enough, the picture becomes clear. This was never really about buying Greenland like a piece of real estate. Not in the way people first assumed. Because ownership is blunt, visible, politically explosive. And Greenland has already said no. Overwhelmingly. The people living there don't want to be Danish. They don't want to be American. They want to be Greenlandic. And that matters. Because direct purchase requires willing sellers. And there aren't any. Which means the real strategy has to look different. More subtle. More gradual. Pressure instead of force. Influence instead of flags. Investment. Defense agreements. Infrastructure funding. Mining partnerships. Not annexation, integration. If American capital builds the ports. If American companies develop the mines. If American security guarantees protect the routes. Then formal sovereignty becomes secondary. On paper, Greenland stays autonomous. In practice, it becomes economically and strategically aligned. This isn't theoretical. China has used this model across Africa and Asia. Control without conquest. Leverage without borders. The difference is that in Greenland, the stakes are even higher. Because this isn't just about profit. It's about who shapes the Arctic as it opens. Who sets the rules for shipping. Who controls access to critical materials. Who denies those advantages to rivals. That's why the rhetoric is escalating. That's why officials talk about urgency. That's why all options keep appearing in public statements. Not because invasion is likely, but because time is limited. The ice keeps melting. Every year, Greenland becomes more accessible, more valuable, more contested. And every year, the cost of being late goes up. The paradox is this. The United States doesn't actually need to own Greenland to get everything it wants. Security access doesn't require annexation. Resource supply doesn't require sovereignty transfer. Trade routes don't require flags on the map. What it needs is cooperation. But cooperation requires restraint, respect, and long-term thinking. History shows that partnerships last. Coercion creates resistance. And Greenland is small enough, connected enough, and politically aware enough. That pressure backfires faster than it works. How this unfolds will tell us a lot about the future of global power. Whether influence in the 21st century comes from dominance, or from alignment. Whether rising competition leads to smarter strategy, or louder threats. And whether great powers can adapt to a world where geography still matters, but people matter more. If you want more deep dives like this, where finance, geopolitics, and long-term strategy intersect, make sure you're subscribed to Finance Archives. This is exactly the kind of story we break down here.